So it was many years ago, and yes, I had hair in those days still at that particular time, that I went to live in Islington North, and I met this guy. I think he splashed me on his bike or something as he went past me, and he eventually persuaded me to be his constituency secretary. I have to say I wasn't the best constituency secretary. I was eager and willing to try and learn and stuff, but it was a time when there was a lot of politics around and a lot of energy. And you've got to say that a lot of the problems I think that we face politically, it's a lack of energy and a lack of commitment and a lack of real commitment to what is actually happening to working class people on the ground in our communities. I don't think anybody could ever say that the person I'm about to introduce doesn't understand and get that entirely. And I think if there was any justice in this world, that I would be introducing to you the Prime Minister of this country. What many of you may not realise is that Jeremy has been a close ally of Bernie's for many years, 30 years or more. They worked together in what and I'll probably get sacked from Unison for saying this, but what I think was the best trade union that ever existed, which is called the National Union of Public Employees. They were both officials within that. They worked together at a local level as councillors in the London Borough of Haringey, and both at the same time became colleagues, became comrades in that den called the Houses of Parliament, when they were both, one was a member for Islington North and the other a member for Tottenham, as we've heard tonight. Colleagues, give a really big, warm welcome to Jeremy Corbyn, MP.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Before I start the lecture, I think it's right that we should say something about coronavirus. No, we should. It's serious. We've got to work together to overcome this outbreak, and we'll only overcome it thanks to the dedication of National Health Service staff, carers and public servants. But we've got to be straight with people that it's going to be much tougher to overcome it because of 10 years of austerity and cuts, counterproductive cuts to all of our public services. There's a lesson here because we're going into this crisis with our public services on their knees. The package the government has announced in the budget is full of holes for workers, especially for BAME workers. Research from the TUC found black workers were twice as likely as average to be in temporary work and much more likely to be on 0 hours contracts. These are precisely the workers now deeply worried because there's been no guarantee that statutory sick pay will be made available to 0 hours contracts workers or those without any contract of employment at all. It's BAME workers who will be disproportionately hit due to the government's lack of action. So I simply say this to Boris Johnson: don't hang BAME workers out to dry in this crisis. Those and migrant workers, particularly women, are on the front line of the battle against coronavirus in our stretched social care and health services. The government must make sure they are supported. And this scandalously low level of SSP at £94 a week compared to, and we just heard from Michael D, the President of Ireland, £266 in Ireland. If we want people to do the right thing and self-isolate, we have to make it financially possible for them to do it. So a message I'm sending out this weekend to all Labour Party members is, obviously, get involved in campaigns, but above all, support the most vulnerable people in our community in the crisis that they're going through. If this government won't stand by the homeless, those threatened with losing their houses, and all the other people that are in fear at the moment because of coronavirus, we will, and we'll be out there working with them and supporting them. I have to say, to me, it's an enormous, enormous pleasure to be invited to give the 20th anniversary Bernie Grant Memorial Lecture. And when Sharon contacted me to invite me to give it, I was quite overwhelmed because it seems to me only yesterday that I was talking to Bernie. He's somebody that's never ever forgotten, and so many people often come up to me and say, what was Bernie like? You knew Bernie very well. And all those people that have spoken before I came onto the platform this evening, I want to say thank you to them. But I also want to give a call out to late friend Narendra Mukherjee, and we had a wonderful memorial for him in this very building after he sadly passed away a year ago. Linton Kwesi Johnson's fantastic poem is amazing, and thank you, Linton, for that, and for all the other poetry you've done, and the way in which you've produced humour, thought and history all in a few lines. It is an amazing talent and amazing skill, and I'm proud to be speaking tonight after you've given that poem. I want to say a huge thank you to David Lammy for what he said tonight, for his work as the MP for Tottenham, and the way that he speaks up in Parliament in support of the Windrush generation and against the racism, and exposes what Boris Johnson and his cronies are absolutely about. And so, David, thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to work with you over all these years that you've been in Parliament, and we're going to be working together in the future on so many issues and so many campaigns. Thank you for what you've done and what you said. To Joe, the leader of the council, I didn't realise that there had only been 7 black council leaders in Britain. I knew it was a small number, I didn't realise it was as few as that. And 4 of those come from just 2 London boroughs, Brent and Haringey. What on earth has the rest of the country been doing? Do they realise what they've missed? Do they realise how wrong they were? And so let's make sure that is changed in the future. Joe, thanks for what you said and for everything that you do. And to my friend Roger, who is presiding over this evening's event, I'll make no comment whatsoever about cycling or hair this evening. We've had quite enough of that. Roger, as a great friend, former councillor in Islington, near neighbour to me, and wonderful Assistant General Secretary of Unison. I almost said NUPE there. I want to say, Roger, thanks for all that you do and the inspiration you give to members of our union when you go to events all over the country to speak up with them and for them. Thanks a lot, Roger, for what you do. And to Sharon, as chair of and inspiration behind the Bernie Grant Cultural Centre, I remember when you talked to me about setting up the Cultural Centre, I said I thought it was an absolutely brilliant idea. I wasn't quite sure how it was ever going to happen, but I realised if it was ever going to happen, it would only be through your energy, your determination and your dedication. Thank you for all of that. And also, of course, to the Artistic Director, Hannah, for what you've made this centre into. I'm very proud to say Bernie was a friend, a comrade and inspiration, and it's a real pleasure sharing a few memories with him, but this lecture is not just about memories of Bernie. David, like Bernie, is proud also of his Guyanese ancestry. Yep. So when I see David, well done, yes, and I've been to Bartica, when we see David standing up against racism, the hostile environment, the Windrush generation, Bernie is looking down. He'd be very proud. Because it is about remembering those that went before us. It is about remembering those that made huge sacrifices that others would be able to live in an environment free of racism. Tomorrow, I'll be on the Blackstock Estate in Finsbury Park, or Highbury Hill, tomorrow afternoon, where we're unveiling a plaque in memory of Andrea Levy, the chronicler of the Windrush generation, who lived and grew up in that area. And her novel, Small Island, introduces us this wonderful man, Gilbert Joseph, the RAF serviceman, who rused the day that he came back to Britain. He can list all England's major canals and industry, but at the same time, most British people couldn't even find Jamaica on the map. And so in the book, he asked this very simply: how come England did not know me? That's a question that could equally be applied when Bernie first came to England. He arrived here, Bernard Alexander Montgomery Grant, known as Bernie to all of us, but he was also called Monty. I never dared call him Monty, but some people did. And it's the Britain of small islands that Bernie arrived at in 1963. That was the time when there were signs saying, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. It was the time of sus laws, of Rachmanite landlords in London, Birmingham and many other cities, and the squalor they brought with them. It was a time of police brutality, and it was a time of the rise of the National Front, and it was only 5 years before Enoch Powell made his appalling, abominable Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 in Birmingham. And in the words of Andrew Levy, the streets that Bernie and the Windrush generation walked were not paved with gold, but some diamonds appeared on the ground in the rain. And I think one of those diamonds was Bernie Grant. My friendship with Bernie and his political career could provide enough memories and campaign lessons to fill the whole lecture series, not just tonight. I first met him in 1976 in Haringey. He was on the Trades Council, he was in the Union of Postal Workers, because he worked at the International Telephone Exchange at the aptly named Mondial House. Others told me he never did any work at all, because he spent all his time being a trade union organiser and shop steward. I think that's very unfair. He did some work, but he did a great deal of trade union representation, and he did that absolutely brilliantly. He lived in North Tottenham in Riola Close. We hit it off from the very beginning. We often argued, because you couldn't know Bernie without arguing with him. He enjoyed a good argument, but he never held any grudge afterwards. Well, not for long anyway. Well, not very long. But, you know, he had that fantastic sense of humour. He used to turn up at my house sometimes in the morning, bang on the door. Jeremy, what are you doing? Why aren't you up yet? I said, Bernie, it's 8 o'clock. Well, he should have been up, because you should have known I was coming. Well, you didn't tell me you were coming. Okay, well, I'm here now. And then he would come up with the latest idea he had. Then the National Front began to get bigger and more serious, and they planned a march along Green Lanes, past Duckett's Common and up through the high road in Wood Green, and we decided this had to be opposed. So a group of us got together to oppose the National Front march. Bernie, myself and others. We organised this massive demonstration to try and stop them. 5,000 people came to that demonstration on Duckett's Common, and we totally disrupted the National Front march, and they were prevented from marching in the future. That was St George's Day, 1977. And as Bernie and I were organising this event, it was during the GLC election campaign at the time, I got a call from the head office of the Labour Party at the time saying, what are you doing? You're organising a demonstration. It's going to clash with the election campaign. I said, I don't think you should separate the campaign against racism from the campaign to elect Labour councillors. They're not different things. They should be one and the same thing and part of the same process. And they said, well, wouldn't it be better if you just called off the demonstration and let the National Front march through and everybody will forget about it? Oh, yeah. So I said, well, that's a very interesting idea, but how much of German history have you studied? And the person on the other end of the phone went quiet and said, what are you on about? I said, well, what I'm on about is German history. They said, why? I said, think through. Those that let the Nazis grow in Central Europe were the ones that ended up being murdered by the Nazis 15 and 20 years later. You cannot allow fascists and racists to control our streets. You have to stand up against them. And a year later, Bernie became a councillor representing Bruce Grove on Haringey Council. And then he succeeded me as chair of the Community Development Committee. This was the committee that was the bane of the council's life because it had a budget of its own, and we built many community centres, and I used to spend a lot of time arguing with the Labour group that I didn't have a big enough capital budget, and this was a time that there was relatively more money around in local government, and I was one year only offered a 20% rise in my budget for the following year. I demanded 25%. I threatened to resign if I didn't get it. So I compromised on 22.5%. But think it through. This is 1970s, a 22.5% rise in the budget for 1 year for one department. And from that, we helped to build community centres all over the borough. And Bernie carried on that work. And from that, we got the West Indian Centre and so many more. But it was about empowering people and communities. And as Roger said, we also worked together in the National Union of Public Employees, where Bernie was instrumental in equal opportunities policies, which sounds fine and simple and straightforward, but it's not. It's not fine and simple and straightforward. When you have a powerful union organisation in some departments of some councils, or indeed in the print industry or other places, where effectively the union can decide who gets the next job. Now, at one level, that sounds fine. That's power. That's power of a union position in that. But the problem with that is that mirrors the community that is already there. And that would end up with very few black workers in certain departments of certain councils or in other industries. There has to be an equal opportunities policy. Otherwise, you end up actually not setting out to do it, but you end up racially discriminating against a very large number of people. So Bernie raised this whole issue in the union. It was very uncomfortable for the union that he should raise it, but he did. And he changed the union's policy and attitude to all of that. And he then went on to work for the Black Trade Union Organisation, which was supported by the GLC in the 1980s. So Bernie was a far-thinking person who looked all this through and developed a lot of those policies also when he became leader of Haringey Council. And as Joe was explaining, he came under enormous attack after the Broadwater Farm riots. And I remember I was away in Cyprus at one point, and I phoned Bernie, and I said, "How are you?" He said, "Well, the press are really going for me." He said, "You once told me that all publicity is good publicity." I said, "Well, Bernie, I mean, there's caveats to that." He said, "You didn't have any caveats when you told me that." He said, "Have you read the Daily Mail today?" So I said, "Well, fortunately, it's not on sale here in Cyprus." He said, "Well, I'll keep it for you when you get back and you'll see what it's like." But Bernie went through all of that, suffered all the brickbats that the media can possibly throw at an individual. Barmy Bernie headlines, all this sort of stuff, really vicious stuff. Yet, the people of Tottenham, the Labour Party in Tottenham, still realised what a gem you had in Bernie, and he was selected to succeed Norman Atkinson as the MP for Tottenham and elected in 1987, along with the other comrades at that time, Paul Batang, Keith Vaz and Diane Abbott. And that was the most amazing election result. The first time since the 1920s a black person had been elected to the British Parliament. And Bernie was very much part of that and was an amazing contribution to Parliament. He was always involved in representing Tottenham, also, of course, but also international causes. And there are many I could refer to, but there's just one or two I want to mention. After the US invasion of Grenada, Bernie and I were very strongly opposed to it. This was 83. At that time, Bernie was a councillor. And we went to Grenada together with Nadine Finch, who's here tonight. And thank you, Nadine, for coming tonight and all the work that you did in supporting the people of Grenada at that time. And we went there and we met American soldiers that were part of the occupying force, and we tried to visit Bernard Cord in prison. We were denied access to the prison. We made as much fuss as we could about it in rather difficult circumstances, and Bernard Cord was indeed threatened with execution at that time. And it was poignant to me that last year Bernard came to my office and he said, "You don't realise how important it was that Bernie and you came there at that time, because I believe I would have died but for your presence there. And I don't know whether that's absolutely the case or not, but I do know that Bernie was totally serious about acts of international solidarity. He went to South Africa in 1990 when Nelson Mandela was released, and rather bizarrely was invited by Margaret Thatcher to give her a briefing on his visit. And I said, Bernie, are you serious about this? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I thought you were joking. And she really asked you to give him... And he said, yeah. And he went there and he just went through, point by point by point, what apartheid meant, what the living standards were of the poorest black people in South Africa, what the heroism was of Mandela and all the others in the ANC. And Bernie was absolutely part of the anti-apartheid movement. And so it was this global vision and view that Bernie had, but it was practical, it was on the ground, it was there, and it was using his voice in Parliament to speak up for those causes. And he, in 1991, when the Gulf War was the problem, the issue, pre-Iraq War, this was the Gulf War, and Bernie actually went to Iraq in order to try to ensure there was negotiations rather than killings and bombings, and pointed out that the occupation wouldn't go well for the people of Iraq. And then you look years later at the effect of depleted uranium weapons and the effect of cancers in southern Iraq as a result of that. Bernie was absolutely on top of these issues. And together, later, in 1994, we went to Uganda for the 7th Pan-African Congress in Kampala. And that was absolutely fascinating experience. And I remember so well one big event we were at. There were various sisters and brothers from all parts of Africa talking at an economic session of the 7th PAC about industrial development. And then there was a group sitting at the back. I didn't know who they were or where they were from, and they very determined to come and speak. And the chair of that session maybe didn't see them as the highest priority, but they kept persisting. So they came to the front and indeed spoke. And they introduced themselves as representing the Rust Belt of the USA. They were all from Detroit and Chicago. And they said, speaking on behalf of the Rust Belt, these were their words, don't go down that road of just following the industrial strategies of Europe and North America. Jump a phase to high technology, jump a phase that will give a real hope and a real future for the next generation. Wow. So Bernie was across that, and he was also across the environmental issues that were being faced by people in Uganda and indeed many other countries. So Bernie was somebody that was there always doing things, and I want to just thank him for all of that. My last vision of Bernie was visiting him in the Middlesex Hospital. He was in bed in this room, surrounded by about 10 of us, sitting in a sort of respectful semicircle around the bed. And Bernie was basically holding court. He was sort of saying, Jeremy, what do you think about so-and-so? No, let me tell you. And everybody asked their opinion, then told them what he thought their opinion should be. And the nurses were clearly absolutely in awe of Bernie and running in and out with support and refreshments for him. And he was obviously in deep pain. And that was the last conversation I had with him. What a great friend, what a great comrade. I want to talk about two particular elements of his work tonight. His attempts to get Britain to understand our colonial history and the representation of black people in Britain, of which Bernie was a pioneer. He was a pioneer in the same way that John Archer was a pioneer, the first mayor of Battersea in 1912, that Saklet Vala was as MP for Battersea later on, as Dadabai Naraji had been as an MP in Finsbury. And Bernie was a pioneer. And Marcus Garvey said this, people without knowledge of their past history, origin and culture is like a tree without roots. This is a very powerful metaphor for the terrible impact of colonialism and enslavement. But in Britain, we are in many ways also a tree without roots, a people without sufficient knowledge of our own past history. I want to quote the late, great Stuart Hall. He put it this way: I'm the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. There are thousands of others beside me that are the cup of tea itself. Because they don't grow it in Lancashire, you know. That is the symbolisation of English identity. What does anybody in the world know about an English person except they can't get through the day without a cup of tea? Where does it come from? Sri Lanka? India? That is the outside history. That is the inside. That is inside the history of the English. There is no English history without that other history. He could not have put it any better than that. So, black history is British history. Why, in children's history classes, can we talk about Hastings, Trafalgar, Waterloo, and Dunkirk, but not the Zulu War, the partition of India, the Opium Wars, the Mau Mau Uprising, or the Morant Bay Rebellion? Why is it that when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we talk about the spinning jenny and steam power, but less about slavery or the violent suppression of whole swathes of the globe? Why is the story of the end of slavery so often reduced to a simple morality tale about a few white men, such as William Wilberforce, however noble they were? The slave trade was an abomination, a tragedy on an unimaginable scale over an appallingly long time. At least 11 million Africans, possibly many more, were transported to the Americas. Around 3 million of those on British ships. And they were very small ships in those days. Think of the number of ships. Millions more died en route. They endured conditions painful to imagine, treated as nothing but cargo, chained by neck and the legs, packed so tightly that sometimes there was only room to lay on their sides, on shelves as little as 18 inches between them, for a crossing that lasted often 2 whole months. Disease on board the ships was rife, the stench was unbearable, the air below decks could be of such bad quality that candles wouldn't burn. From one description, I should warn you, this is extremely graphic. Alexander Falconbridge, a ship's surgeon, recounted how the floor would become so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. He described how the sick would have to lie on bare planks, and he wrote, "Those who are emaciated frequently have their skin and even their flesh entirely rubbed off by the motion of the ship from the prominent parts of the shoulder, elbow and hips, so as to render the bones in those parts quite bare." Sometimes up to half of those being transported would die of dysentery and fever. On one British slave ship, 132 people suffering from illness were thrown into the sea to drown. Because if they'd died on board, the owners of the ship would not have been entitled to claim insurance. And of course, those lucky enough to survive the horror of the crossing were rewarded with the brutality of slavery for the rest of their lives. Remy Capo is in the audience tonight somewhere. Remy? Thank you, Remy. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the book that you very kindly sent to me. He described the scene in this equally grim and shocking detail in his book, Reap the Forgotten Harvest. Remy kindly sent it to me, and I found it hard to read. And the part I want to quote to you is very graphic and beautifully written. Condemned, the slave was strung up by his wrists from the main yard arm. 50 lashes were applied. Then a hangman's noose was dropped around the neck of the half-conscious slave. Taking up the slack, the 6-man crew heaved. The slave rose up onto his toes, fingering the palpitating abdomen of his petrified victim. The captain turned around with a twinkle in his eye and grinned. "Forget the screws, Mr. Graceforth," he said. "I have a different scheme. I think this one has been belly worshipping." Grasping his sword handle, the captain drew a finger lovingly along its shining edge. Placing the tip of the sword at the top of the victim's pulsing ribcage, the captain turned with an evil grin. A queasy sensation crept into Wimborne's gut. Wimborne was one of the officers on the ship. Turning to the 6-man pulling crew, the captain jerked his thumb upwards. Trotting backwards with the rope, they yanked the victim high into the air. The blade sliced the belly open from top to bottom. Out gushed a bloody porridge. Twitching and groaning, the disemboweled slave swung back and forth with his entrails convulsing above the deck. Strangling in the fresh breeze, a trail of blood along the deck defined the full extent of this pendulum motion. It's impossible, absolutely impossible not to wonder, how could people participate in such cruelty against their fellow human beings for so long? And then you have to look at the economy of the time, and the answer is quite simply the money that was made from the sugar industry and the slave trade. Walk around British cities, Liverpool, Bristol or London. You will see the streets named after wealthy slave traders and grand buildings paid for by the suffering of Africans thousands of miles away all that time ago. That is the history that too many and too often in this country people are ashamed to remember. Bernie himself was not taught this history in school. His European teachers in colonial British Guiana did not think it appropriate. We see the results in the failure to understand and come to terms with it all around us. It's the failure to understand our history that results in professional boxer Vernon Van Riel, once a St Anne's Road and Chestnuts Road resident, going from fighting at the Royal Albert Hall to being deported to Jamaica and living destitute in a derelict shack. It means that citizens of Britain's former colonies have been converted into immigrants. When Parliament debated the Windrush scandal, the words illegal immigrant and illegal immigration were uttered dozens of times, as David so frequently had to correct ministers and Tory MPs in doing that. It results in this government chartering a deportation plane to take people to Jamaica, back across the very same ocean their ancestors had earlier travelled in shackles on those slave ships. We still do not know how many British citizens were wrongfully deported under the hostile environment. It must rank as one of the greatest insults in history that when slavery was finally abolished in parts of the British Empire in 1833, Parliament compensated slave owners for the loss of their property, while the victims of slavery described in this brilliant book got nothing. That payout to thousands of British slave owners, including a distant relative of David Cameron, was vast. £20 million. Or, think of it another way, 40% of the government's annual income at that time, making it one of the largest ever bailouts in British history. The equivalent share of government income today would amount to £300 billion. It required a loan so large the British taxpayers were still paying it off until 2015, when the hostile environment was in full swing. And just £62,198 has been paid out in compensation to 36 victims of the Windrush scandal. A reckoning with our past, our whole past, not just a manicured and selective history, is well, well overdue. Bernie understood this. He lived it. His experiences were deeply imbued in his politics. He articulated it. He represented, as Roger and others have pointed out, he represented not just his constituents, but everyone suffocated by racism and oppression. I've never forgotten when Bernie was first elected, he was overwhelmed with letters and correspondence and postcards and requests and demands from people all over the world who saw his election a little bit of their own triumph, and they were right. Bernie had enormous demands placed upon him. There have been some forward steps made. Glasgow University has started a programme of reparative justice in response to having benefited from slavery itself. It's established a new Glasgow Caribbean Centre for Development Research, which is to be run jointly with the University of the West Indies. It's renamed buildings and elected a memorial to those that were enslaved. Modest developments, but important. They're significant in breaking through what Afua Hirsch has described as the paralysis of fear and denial on this issue. So I'm proud that Labour has committed to improving the teaching of black history and the history of the British Empire, imperialism and slavery. I'm proud of the Emancipation Education Trust that Dawn Butler and I have supported and announced the launching of it in Bristol, one of the cities that did so well, or some people did so well in Bristol, out of the slave trade. And whilst we didn't win the election, we're going to take that forward because it's important that we have that taken forward at all times. And I'm sure you would agree, in the light of Windrush, this is more important than ever. We should know what went on around the world in Britain's name. And we should know where so much of the wealth of so many of our big companies and corporations came from. There's a brilliant book called Capitalism and Slavery, written by the late Eric Williams, who was the first Prime Minister of independent Trinidad in 1962. He wrote that book as his PhD thesis at the London School of Economics, and I first got a copy of it in Trinidad in 1968. Absolutely fascinating book, and it taught me so much. It taught me so much about the origins of the wealth of so many of our major banks and major companies in this country. And Bernie was a campaigner for reparations and other colonial governments to the global south who had suffered under imperialism. Bernie's whole speeches in Parliament were about bringing justice to the understanding of history. And he would have been, and he often mentioned, the great work done, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, by Walter Rodney. And he demanded that the British government recognise its crimes and apologise to all those people of African origin for what he saw as the biggest crime in human history. He condemned the debts of demanded the debts of black countries be cancelled and that substantial sums be repaid to them to invest in their future. David Cameron did go to Jamaica and did offer to build a new prison. I think we can do a bit better than that. Because it's not just about history, it's about tackling the ongoing legacy of the outrage of colonialism. Since the 1960s, the form of imperialism that we see now is informal empire, ensuring that the former colonisers continue to control their old colonies so resources keep flowing from south to north. Why? Primary products are still the mainstay of the economies of so many former colonies in Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, and so on. And it's what Kwame Nkrumah was right when he called neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. And he wrote a great deal about that, both whilst he was president of Ghana and later on in his life. So when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank forced countries in the global south to roll back the state with their structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s, it was a disaster. The independence movements of the 1950s and 1960s had achieved that political independence, and Nkrumah particularly wanted to develop an economic system in Africa which gave some degree of economic independence to Africa. The debt crisis of the 1970s and later debt crises meant that the IMF turned up with its structural adjustment programs and the role of the state and the public sector was rolled back. So let's reverse the agenda of using trade and aid to trap the poorest countries at the bottom of the ladder, exporting crops and primary products, leaving people vulnerable to the lottery of fluctuating markets. And when you talk about the problems of services in the south, we're quite rightly concerned about the coronavirus in Britain, Europe, North America. You may not have read much about it. There's a smallpox epidemic in the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the moment. Hasn't had much publicity. They don't have the health infrastructure to deal with it. That is the imbalance and injustice of our world. So we also can't talk about international justice without mentioning the environmental and climate crisis. Tackling the destruction of our climate is a question of justice. The countries that have contributed the least to causing climate breakdown are those that are being hit the hardest by its effects. Britain and other industrialised countries must now step up and take their share of responsibilities, up to and including and beyond COP26 in Glasgow later this year. And as we develop new environmentally friendly energy technologies, we must make sure those technologies are freely and cheaply available to countries in the global south. It's about sharing the benefits we've got of high technology, not hoarding them in the north for a new form of colonial relationship with the poorer countries in the world. And we must stop international aid being spent on fossil fuel projects and instead make sure that international aid goes on development projects that are sustainable. And seek to engage with those, the receiving end of climate breakdown in the global south, who are leading the way and how to tackle it. I want to talk about the second element of Bernie's work. To me, one of Bernie's biggest legacies is often that of black self-representation. When Bernie wore a dashiki in Parliament to the state opening in 1983, that was black self-representation. And there's a wonderful picture of Bernie standing next to the Speaker's chair, telling me off for wearing a very poor quality jacket compared to what he was wearing at the time. And he became also, as we've said, the first black local authority leader and an MP elected because of the campaign for black self-representation. He was the first chair of the Parliamentary Black Caucus. That was black self-representation, which had come about because of the campaign for black sections within the Labour Party and understanding the need for self-representation. Bernie was the link between black communities in Britain and the corridors of power, at a time when ethnic minority communities didn't have the voice they should have had and did not have the platform to speak out. He was the link between black communities in Britain and black communities, black nations and anti-racist campaigns all across the world. In all of these ways and more, he was a pioneer, he was a trailblazer, and he was an inspiration. To be proudly a black man in public life in Parliament in the 1980s was not an easy task. So I'm very proud that in his memory, as I've been concerned about levels of representation of the black community within the Labour Party and within our political system, we've launched the Bernie Grant Leadership Programme to address the underrepresentation of black, Asian and ethnic minority communities in Parliament, in local government and across our movement. And I was privileged to meet the first graduates of the Bernie Grant Leadership Programme recently, and they're fantastic people, and they are very much the future of our movement, our community and our party. It's a fitting tribute to Bernie's legacy that our efforts to empower a new generation of black, Asian and ethnic minority members carries his name. And 46% of the 2019 intake of Labour MPs. It was a very sad day, December the 12th and 13th, when we got the election results. But the silver lining to the cloud is that 46% of that intake are black, Asian or minority ethnic people, and 77% of the intake are women. So there is some good that came out of the 2019 general election campaign. So I look around me today and I see the representation in Parliament and the arts and our public life, and I think of Bernie. When I see Stormzy as the first black solo British headliner at Glastonbury speaking truth to power with such grace, raising issues of racism in our criminal justice system, talking about how black people are held back from expressing themselves through the arts, hence this wonderful Bernie Grant Arts Centre, communicating how structural racism and privilege holds people of colour back in all walks of life. That is what black self-representation is about. 20 years after his death, I know that Bernie would be so proud of all those who are carrying on the struggle for equality and standing tall and standing very, very proud. Friends, centuries of barbarity could only be justified by inventing an ideology of racism that still poisons our world today. In modern Britain, black people are still hugely underrepresented in positions of power, politics, academia, and the judiciary. We must stop the cascade of prejudice from one generation to another. That's what Bernie worked for all his life to achieve. That example and that legacy of his struggle, is a gift to us. Bernie was somebody that enjoyed life, enjoyed company, enjoyed debate, enjoyed discussion, but above all, he sought to empower young people. The way in which he could meet young people, be they black or white, talk to them about their situation, about the problems they faced, on housing, on jobs, on training, all the difficulties they faced. And he brought people together to inspire them of what they could achieve together. Bernie was somebody that taught us all so much, and it was a privilege and an honour to be a very good friend to Bernie. And I hope tonight's lecture has brought back some memories to many people in this room that knew Bernie very well. In his memory, we carry on. Thank you very much indeed.